Welcome to Constitutional Defenders, where we discuss important issues and cases related to criminal defense and how criminal defense attorneys handle these cases on a daily basis. Today, we're answering listener questions about the Tomasik case and discussing what we did as a defense team to exonerate an innocent man. Welcome to Episode 5. Welcome back to Constitutional Defenders. I am Lizzie, your producer extraordinaire, and today I am with Mary.
Hi, Lizzie.
Hi, Mary. T.
Hey, Lizzie. Great to be back.
Yeah. And Kim.
Hello.
Hi, Kim. How are you?
I'm doing great. How are you?
Great. Welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you.
We're very happy you're here. So today, Mary, what are we talking about?
We had quite a few listeners ask us about our very first episode, which was the exoneration of an innocent man, and it was about the Dennis Tomasik case. He had been wrongfully accused, wrongfully convicted, wrongfully imprisoned for 9 years. We handled the retrial, and he was exonerated. A lot of people wanted to know how we did it. The first episode talked quite a bit with Dennis's wife, Kim Tomasik, about her role and how challenging it was for her to be waiting for her husband to be released from prison and all that she did to get him released. So today we are going to answer some listener questions that had been provided to us about how we actually exonerated Dennis Tomasik.
Awesome. And I think, to be clear, I should say that Kim, that is with us right now, is Kim Barris, our other paralegal extraordinaire. So not Kim Tomasik.
Not Kim Tomasik.
Or for the purposes of clarity, in the role that she was serving during the trial, the top. Right? And what does top mean, Lizzie?
The Tactical Operations Paralegal.
Right. So it's important. Lizzie is frequently the trial paralegal, so she'll go to court. She'll be serving in that role. Kim frequently is our top paralegal, meaning she's our tactical operations person. She is handling everything back at the office. She's kind of like Oz behind the screen, you know, making it all happen, like the puppet master, making sure that everybody is in their right place, has what they need, any research that we need to have done. It's an amazingly challenging role. She cannot, it's interesting, people will say, well, you know, if Lizzie's in court, right, can Kim take time off? No, right. She knows that, right. Your teeth better be fine. Right? Your teeth better be fine. You're not going to the dentist. I mean, there's just like no rest.
There's been many times where I've slacked Kim during trial and been like, Mayday, Kim, I need you.
Panic. And to be clear, Dennis was incarcerated for a CSC, which is criminal sexual conduct. A very troubled young man had accused him of criminal sexual conduct in roughly 2006. He said it had happened 10 years prior. So when we took over the case for the retrial, we were investigating these 20-year-old allegations, which makes it even more challenging than when it's something that happened allegedly a week ago or a year ago or a month ago. So one of the first questions that people had, we had asked Kim Tomasik to talk about her role, and we talked with her about the fact that when she came in to retain us, she brought these boxes and boxes of items that she had been keeping and preparing for 9 years. So Kim Barris, our top Kim, what did you do? Because I know this is what happens, right? We're like, here you go, and we hand all these boxes over. And then tell us how you handled that part of it, because it's really significant. It sets the stage for the entire case.
Critical, yeah.
Yeah, well, she did keep everything. So it was a lot of sifting through to see what was there, what we could use, organizing it, making sure we had it all scanned in, making sure it was readily available. We had to index it so we knew what we had, and just review everything.
And the role of the person who's doing that in this situation, Kim, is so critical because the index is really important. We had receipts from Kim Tomasik from over 20 years ago for an electronic game system and, a bicycle and those sorts of things.
Bed frames, all sorts.
Right. Oh, yeah. Bed frames, red bunk beds. we had no idea really the significance of it until we started piecing the case together. And then we were like, okay, well, those receipts were important for a particular reason, which, Lizzie, you can talk about. But if we didn't have that index, there was so much paper in this case, and there frequently is, you wouldn't even know what you had. I mean, there'd be no way to remember that.
Right. And you don't know when you're originally going through something. You know, I might have looked at those receipts as one of the very first pieces of information that I looked at. And you don't, like you said, don't know the significance of that until you put all the pieces together. So it is critical that everything that you get be indexed, no matter how minute you think it might be in the beginning. It could be something that's super important later on.
And those receipts were so critical. Lizzie, why don't you tell our listeners why those receipts were so important?
So the receipts that we had, one of them was a receipt from the bike shop where our client's son got his very first racing bike. And that was important because the complainant's claim was that he was in the bedroom, the son's bedroom, and saw all these trophies when he was getting molested the first time. And the receipt was important because the date he said this happened, or at least the year that it happened, the client's son, Ethan, hadn't even started racing yet. I believe it was 2 years later or a year later.
Right, 2 years.
And so the receipt from the bike just showed that the bike hadn't even been purchased yet. Now, the bike shop that they purchased it from, the owner of that shop had retired, and he had moved down to Florida. So, unfortunately, I had to annoy him in his retirement to get him to sign a record certification form to prove that the receipt really was something from his shop. But that was important because that showed that even though he was saying it was this date and he remembered it so well and he saw those trophies, it couldn't have been because the bike hadn't even been purchased. He hadn't started racing yet.
Well, Lizzie, I would just take exception to one portion of that description you gave. You didn't annoy him. You just provided him you provided him with purpose, direction, motivation. That's what you did.
Exactly. I'm sure he loved hearing from me.
That's
But
right.
I don't know that he agrees with Dakura's description of it. But the business record part is so important because people will hand you receipts and think, well, you can just get this admitted. And you can't. You can't just get a receipt admitted. It has to come in through a witness. In this situation, it was either going to be the owner of the bike shop, we'd have to drag him back from Florida, or the business records exception. But you need to do that early enough to give the government notice that you are not going to necessarily put a witness on the stand to authenticate the receipt, that someone has filled out an affidavit, and then instead of that person, you're getting it in that way, and they'll have an opportunity to object in advance of trial. That's really important for listeners and lawyers. Lawyers obviously I would hope would know, but you've got to really work on it early enough because if you get the receipt 2 days before trial, there's likely not enough time to get a witness to authenticate that and then to give the other side notice that complies with the court rules.
Now, Mary, remind me for the bunk bed receipt. So let me clarify first for listeners that there was a receipt from 1995 from Kim Tomasic that showed that these bunk beds, these red bunk beds that, once again, the complainant said that he distinctly remembers being in Ethan, the son's bedroom when he was being molested, that it was on these red bunk beds. And we had a receipt showing, once again, bunk beds hadn't been purchased yet. So I do remember trying to track down anyone from that business because the business had closed. It was a furniture store in Grand Rapids. So what did we do for that?
So for the bunk beds, the receipt was actually later. I think it would have been 1999 because the allegation was it occurred in 1996, 1997. And to put that in context, the complainant said he had very specific, detailed memory of the first time he was assaulted. It was on red bunk beds. There were trophies in the room, and he had been playing a very particular video game. And then our client, pulled him from that game and molested him. So all of those things were really important to show that it wasn't as the complainant claimed. What we wound up doing for the bunk bed receipt is we provided all the information to the government that this business had shut down, we couldn't track anyone down, and that we were going to be admitting it through Mrs. Tomasik. She would be able to testify, and they didn't object to that. So that's how we handled that. But we literally, I know you specifically, Lizzie, spent literally hours and hours and hours trying to track somebody down, and the business had shut down and tried to find, who was still in charge of it.
Did I draft an affidavit for that?
I think you did.
Yeah,
You did.
because I did. I spent days trying. I went to the Lara site and tried to figure out like the address, a name, anyone, and just couldn't find anything.
Right. We put everything in there, all the steps that you had taken, showed them that the business was closed. There was no one who could serve as in any sort of capacity as having been affiliated with that business. And that, again, we would be getting it in through Mrs. Tomasik as long as she could lay the foundation. And again, they didn't object to that. Mm-hmm. So we had bunk bed receipts. We had the bike receipt that was really important. Also, the video game. Kurt, do you want to talk to us about that?
Right. The Sony PlayStation is the system that Ethan owned, but the complainant claimed that it was a Nintendo. And for those of us who have actually played on these gaming systems know that they're completely different. But what was critical is that, first of all, we had the actual PlayStation. The box that it came in, which showed that it had not even been manufactured at the time that the complainant claimed that he was being molested and they were playing on it. So, irrespective of who you believed was more credible, right? The box spoke for itself. Res ipsa loquit, as we would say, right?
The box speaks for itself. That's a good one. And then there were the trophies. Ethan hadn't started racing yet, as Lizzie spoke about, and so he didn't have any trophies in his room. What we had for that were magazines that showed when Ethan started racing and he was a rookie, and then that was after the claimed date of the first assault, and we were able to get those in as well to show that Ethan hadn't started even racing at that point, and he didn't start winning trophies for a few years after that. Another really important part of this was figuring out how would the complainant know about Ethan's bedroom if he had never been in it or had never been molested. And it's really important. We had so much contact with the Tomasik family, which is why we're so close with them now. And they were never annoyed. We would call them multiple times, sometimes in a day, to try and fill in these holes. Because while the complainant, when he was younger, had been at the household less than a handful of times with Mrs. Tomasik, no one could ever figure out, well, how would he know these things about the bedroom after the fact? Because when those bunk beds were purchased, the complainant had stopped going over to the house at that point. So Kim Barris and I took quite a few trips to the Tomasik household, but tell us how we figured out how we would know.
Everyone knew, because you could see into the windows and into Ethan's bedroom from the driveway and even from the road out front. He had two windows. One faced the front, towards the road, and there was one on the side that faced the neighbor's house, who actually owned a daycare. So there were always kids playing out in the yard, and anytime that anybody was outside out front, you could see right into Ethan's room. You could see the trophies, you could see the bed. You could see it all. So.
And at that point, their other daughter, when we were there, Shelby that was her room, 20 years later. And we could see, so we took a lot of photographs. We took photographs all times of the day or night. And the bus stop was at the end of the Tomasik driveway. So kids and their parents would go there for years to wait for the bus. You could look right in that window. Again, we took all these photographs to show you could see exactly what was going on in that window, or in that room through the window. And we spoke with neighbors who said, I know exactly what Ethan's bedroom looks like. I've literally never been into the Tomasik household because I've been taking my kids to the bus stop for years.
And to be clear, it's a short driveway, right?
Mm-hmm.
I don't think
it's not
we
a
made
long
that
driveway.
clear. It's a short,
Right.
And also, shout out to Shelby, who had a new baby girl 2 weeks ago.
That's right.
That's right.
Congrats. also, we took, Kim Barris and I took a lot of measurements of the Tomasic household. We measured from room to room because the complainant said he was being molested in the bedroom and he was screaming. And we measured between the houses because, as Kim said, there was a daycare next door. There were always kids playing outside. We hollered so we could see, could you hear from one room to the next, from outside in, all of this. And Takura, how did you use those measurements at trial? Because that became really significant.
For me, that was one of the most fun parts of the trial. We had argued a jury review motion for the jurors to be able to go and look and walk through the Tomasic household. And we weren't surprised when the judge said no. Fortunately, though, we had the measurements. So what I did was I had Ethan, who was in the witness box, tell me when to stop when I'd stepped back far enough that I'd gotten the length of the room and then the width. And it turned out that the dimensions of the room were smaller than the jury box. So the entire time I kept referencing, oh, you mean the room that's smaller than the box that the jurors are sitting in? So my goal was to make sure that they felt like they were in that room the whole time. And to the point about the complainant screaming and whether people were able to hear him, I actually turned my back away from the microphone, asked if he could hear me and whether the jurors could hear me, and they could. So at another point, I even turned and pointed at the government and said, oh, so it's even smaller than the table that the government is sitting at, combined with the defense one, and I walked up to the prosecutor.
They love that.
That's right. So, but again, the entire time going forward, I just kept referencing, oh, the size of the jury box, and comparing that to the size of all the small rooms in the home.
And I think that was so important just because for me, I'm terrible with distances and measurements. Ask me how far away is 20 feet, and I'd be like, Kim's 20 feet away.
Right.
Kim's probably like 5 feet away. So not even. She's probably 3 feet away.
Like 3.
See, I don't even know. So like, I think that's so important for people to have that visual because you hear numbers, but you're like, how far away how small is that? I don't know.
Right.
But showing that, I thought that was so important.
You need to paint that picture.
Yeah.
And Kerr used a tape measure at trial. So Ethan would hold one end of it, and then he would say, stop me when I get to 12 feet or whatever the distance was between the two.
Right.
And I think that was, again, so important for the jury to see that. Visuals are so important at trial, which we'll talk about in a little bit. As lawyers, we always think verbally, right? What answer do we want to get or hope to get from a witness? What are our questions going to be? We think so much in that term, whereas jurors, they don't want to just listen for days on end. I don't want to listen for days on end, right? I mean, I sometimes listen to myself and I'm like, stop talking. But the visual, being able to show with as many witnesses you can, the photos of the house, how big the dimensions were, using whiteboards, everything, it was so important.
There's a study that was all on jurors and how different people learn. And I looked into it for Kim and I's presentation that we did at CDM. And it shows that people or jurors will hold on to more important details if they are visually, they're shown to them or explained to them in that way rather than just telling them. Because most people are visual learners, not auditory learners.
I think that makes sense. And for listeners, CDM is the Criminal Defense Attorneys of Michigan. Lizzie and Kim did an amazing presentation there, and they rocked it out.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you very much.
Tell me more.
Yes. And I was going to add to that point about visual aids. There were a lot of dates which I frankly, if I had not seen them up on the board and for the purposes of impeachment, wouldn't have made a lot of sense. So can you tell us, Mary, how you use the whiteboard?
Sure. We come with a lot of items for trial. So we have, as everyone here knows, we have a whiteboard that we use. We have a white flip pad. We have a burden of proof chart that we frequently use at trial if that's significant to our opening. We have a reasonable doubt board, which we'll talk about for closing. But the dates were really important. When he alleged certain things happened in the inconsistencies between his claims. So, for example, he had made claims and this happened 2 times. Then he would say it happened 50 times. then 10 times, then 100 times, then 600 times. I mean, it went back and forth, back and forth. The dates when those stories would change and what the numbers were, we would write on the whiteboard or the white pad so that the jury could see, okay, well, wait a minute. When you first made this claim, you said this, then the story changed, then the story changed again. And a really significant part of the trial was when we were questioning the complainant, who was up on the stand for about 2 days, or the better part of 2 days, right? I think.
Yeah.
So when we were questioning him about, he had mental health issues and his reactions to certain things, and they were relevant in the context of the trial, and he said that he had only threatened our client's daughter after a particular event had happened to him. And it was, he was adamant about that. But we had the police reports keyed up and ready to go that he had actually threatened the daughter before a particular event occurred. And we were able to not just impeach him with the police reports, but write it on the board. So we said, okay, this is the date that that you made this threat, yes, whatever it was, September 21st in the year. All right, so we were able to show him the police report, lock that in, and then we were able to show him the police report of the event, which had happened after, and then we wrote that date on. And to Lizzie's point, I think that visually emphasizes what we're saying. They don't get lost in the sea of words.
Well, even like working on the case, I mean, you could, I don't know now, it's been a couple of years, but at that time, you could ask us anything about the case, and Kim and I could probably spit all the information out to you. But even knowing the case so well, having it up on the whiteboard really put it into perspective for me, too, because I was like, man, I knew this, but seeing it really hits it home.
And I've been a juror twice before, and it is critical to be able to paint that picture, get an accurate story across so that everybody knows what happened and they can make the best decision.
I mean, this is a case we worked on for over a year, and really, there were so many people working on it, and it was such a team approach. But Kim is right. For a juror, they're just getting these bits and pieces and having to piece it all together. We use something called Case Map in the office, which is really good for dates, where we'll enter in all the critical events and the dates, and then that will put it in a timeline for us. And it's really helpful for us to be able to go back and because a lot of times, again, you're not sure what date is important or what fact is important until you start really piecing the whole case together. Counseling records. So I want to talk about counseling records. These were such a critical piece of the puzzle for the trial. Takura, do you want to talk a little bit about what those counseling records showed about the complainant?
So this individual, I won't even call him a gentleman. Okay. So this individual had been in counseling for many, many years as a youth and never made allegations at the time that he was going to counseling. He was very close to his grandfather. His grandfather passed away, unfortunately, and his parents, to help him cope, sent him to counselors. But again, he'd been seeing so many different counselors, and at the time did not say anything. This would have been the time and place that one would imagine that as he's going through the turmoil that he's experiencing from this separation, this loss from his grandfather, that he would have revealed this. So the absence of him having made this claim was critical. So in a stand-away motion, we don't want to use that inside baseball language, right? But
what's a stand-away motion?
Stand-away motion is where you say, hey, judge, would you please order this therapist, this counselor, or whoever it is, this mental health professional, this doctor, to send these records to your chambers, and then you look at them in camera review. You look at them, and then if there's something relevant, share them with the defense.
What was really interesting about those counseling records is Marty and Chris Tieber handled Dennis's appeal, and they fought for 9 years pro bono to get Dennis released. They did such an amazing job. They put up a fight for these records. Originally, the records had been reviewed by the judge. The judge said, there's nothing important in here. Then it went up to the Court of Appeals. They agreed with the judge, went to the Supreme Court. Supreme Court said, oh, no, there's important stuff in here. Went back down. This is one of the reasons it took 9 years. What was so important about these records was the absence, as Takura said, of any allegation, but also significantly that the complainant had severe mental health issues to the point where he did not understand at times the difference between reality and fantasy. he would make statements and tell stories that were objectively untrue to teachers, counselors, and he would believe them wholeheartedly. He also liked to lie to get adults into trouble. That was part of one of the records. And so that was really important. We had to fight for that to be able to come in at the second trial, because the government said, well, big deal, he lies, so what, right? All teenagers and kids lie at various points in time. But what he was lying about and the fact that he couldn't always understand fantasy versus reality was really important. And that's something we hit on quite heavily at trial. I'm going to ask to Kurt, because I know you reached out to a lot of these folks.
Oh.
Because these were teachers and a few counselors, did they want to testify at trial?
So I'll tell you this. There was one teacher who wanted nothing at all whatsoever to do with me. But I got in well enough with another teacher who convinced her to let me talk to her. And to be clear, these are people who did not have anything negative. They didn't dislike the complainant, right? Fine kid, but he just had difficulties which they spoke on. So I think I spent about 6 weekends in Grand Rapids, going to people's homes, meeting them in coffee shops and everything else, wherever they were comfortable meeting with me. And ultimately, the lady who did not want to talk to me at all, I had the right phone number. I spoke with her. She said, no, wrong phone number, wrong person, hung up on me. And yeah, it wasn't easy to get her, but she turned out to be one of our best witnesses. So it took a lot of time and effort to get these folks on board. And again, once they understood that we didn't want them to malign him, just tell us honestly their experiences with him and just the difficulties that he had in class, it all worked out. But yeah, people who initially wanted nothing to do with me ultimately turned out to be some of our best witnesses. And Ethan Tomasic had some awesome teachers. Mm-hmm. I'm jealous. His first grade teacher had him and his classmates write letters to themselves, to Santa, and then ultimately, once they graduated, would send that same letter to them. How awesome is that? None of my teachers did that.
So tell us about the significance of that teacher and that letter, because that came up at trial.
So that teacher, she actually, I believe, did you question her or was it?
No, it was Takura.
Takura, yeah. He asked her how she remembers Ethan Tomasic and his family. And she said, you always remember the ones that come from good families. And he came from a good family. But she was amazing on the stand. Everyone loved her. And I believe your words were, it was like, as she walked away, it was like little birds, were following her and singing. Everyone loved her.
But one critical thing about her testimony is that the complainant claimed that Ethan was one of his best friends. So when the teacher asked these students to name all their best friends, not just one, Ethan actually named multiple people, right? And other students did the same, but nowhere. Guess who was nowhere on anybody's list? The complainant. All the children in the neighborhood did not have anything positive to say about him. And actually one gentleman who now, at the time, was in Alaska, just really wanted to get in information about how, after the complainant threw a toy on the roof, claimed that it was the witness who did it. So he still felt a way about it. Yes, in his 30s, so decades later. But yeah, no, all the kids, none of them liked the complainant. None of them played with him, didn't go to his home. And one of the complainant's best friends gave us information that was helpful to us and said, oh, no. We didn't play that video game at the Tomasic household. I went to the complainant's home and we did it there. So anyway, it just, all the kids who now were adults, decades later, gave helpful information and actually distanced the complainant from Ethan Tomasic and the other children.
So we broke witnesses up into categories, and there was, obviously the Tomasic family, then there would be Dennis's co-workers, the children from the neighborhood, the neighbors from the neighborhood, and then these sort of outside witnesses, counselors, teachers, Ethan's first grade teacher. And for the first grade teacher, the significance of that, Lizzie and Takura have spoken about that, but Ethan wrote that letter at the end of first grade, where he dictates all of his friends, puts all of his friends in there, and there's a photograph that she includes of all the kids. The complainant wasn't in it. Then when Ethan graduates from high school, this letter is sent to him. Congratulations. And the hilarious thing about this letter is she makes them write what they like about school. And she testifies, she said, but they can't say recess because they would all say recess. So they have to write what they like about school, who their friends are. And the teacher was great. She said they don't have to just be classroom friends. These can be anyone's friends. And the fact that the complainant is saying he tolerated abuse for 2 years because Ethan was his best friend, and we were able to objectively show that he was not Ethan's best friend at all. Ethan didn't write down that he was his best friend, and he didn't go to the house at the number of times he said, and during the time he said. And I want to talk about witnesses, right? Because clients in the Tomasics gave us dozens and dozens, I mean, well over 50, probably over 100 witnesses. Kim and Lizzie, you're that first line of defense, right, where you call. So do you call everybody who's on the list?
Yes.
Right.
Everyone.
Everyone.
Every single person.
And how does that go? What do you kind of ask and what do you screen for? Because you tell us whether you think they'd be a good witness or not, whether we need to follow up, go that second round with them.
Well, I like to just kind of start off with what would you tell me about, whoever I'm calling about, and just see where they fall. Are they going to be positive? Are they going to be negative? Do we want to pursue talking to them any further, get more details and more information? Are they willing to speak with us? Do they seem reluctant? That kind of thing. So.
I normally, when I call, I say, I got your phone number from Dennis Tomasic, and he said you are someone who would be able to chat a little bit about him and the charges that I'm sure you know that are against him. And everyone knew what was going on. Right. There wasn't one person who was like, what? Because everyone was so involved and loved Dennis. So I just said, what can you tell me about Dennis? And then they'd all say wonderful things. And then I'd say, and what can you tell me about the complainant? Have you ever been over to the house? And he was there. Do you know who the complainant is? And everyone that knew who the complainant was, so these were like a lot of neighbors and neighborhood kids, all said the same thing. We were in and out of that house constantly. We were over there playing cards. We were over there hanging out. We were in the garage. We never saw this kid over there. And those that did know who the complainant was, the first thing out of their mouth was always, that kid's a liar. That kid is a liar. And that was just how he was known around the neighborhood. So it's just kind of like, first I ask for a general overview of what they think about Dennis, and then you get further into the claims.
And
right. It leads to different... Oh, sorry.
Sorry, I was just going to add, one thing that's critical to add is these are people whose information Kim Tomasic had given to the original lawyer. And these are people who were willing, and many of them were in the courthouse at the first trial, but were just never called. So they'd been waiting all this time.
Dennis and Kim gave us a list of people and their numbers, and I'm not exaggerating. I think it was like close to 100 different people to call. And so it was just going down the list and calling every single one. And I think there was only one person who didn't call back, and that was because he had passed away. Right. Everyone called back.
And it was impossible for him to call back.
Yeah, exactly, because he had passed away.
I'm sure he would if he
exactly.
But the other thing, too, I know you end your conversations with folks on, anything else, sort of that, Jen, you want to tell me, but also anyone else you think we should contact. And that's how we got more names and numbers than even what the Tomasics had given us, because they were trying to go back, again, 20 years to recreate this event or this time period. And then that kind of gives us, someone else to call. Takur, I'll ask you this question. Would you ever put a witness on the stand without talking to them first? Takur likes to say, hell no.
Right. So I know that there may be some kiddos, listening in with mom and dad. But the short answer is absolutely not. No.
That is what happened in this case. So not only were all these witnesses who were not contacted, but then the original trial lawyer in the first trial, because there would be all these people in the hallway, and he'd be like, okay, well, you're saying that, Sally might have information. Well, let's just put Sally up on the stand with no prep, no questioning of her to find out what she knows, because a lot of times people know information but they don't realize it. They might say, like, well, I don't know anything, but then when you talk to them, you find out, well, they do know things, right? Because they might say, well, listen, I don't know the complainant, I can't help you, but they were at the Tomasic household every day, so they can help because they can say they never saw him there after school. And it's only through that conversation that you know what to ask them on the witness stand or to even put them up. And it was shocking to me that this was I don't even want to call it a strategy, but it was shocking to me that this was the decision making of the original lawyer.
And he actually announced on the record, he says, letting the jurors know and everybody in the courtroom, I've never spoken with you. Isn't that correct? It boggles my mind. I can't believe it. He was proud of this.
It just shows a tremendous lack of preparation when someone is putting their life in your hands. So we talked about sort of these categories of witnesses that I want to go back because this was really important. We put them on in chunks. So we put them on all the coworkers, all the kids in the neighborhood, the adults. So let's talk about the coworkers and the work records. So the complainant had alleged that he had been assaulted after school at the Tomasic household during a particular time frame. And he said this had happened to him, hundreds and hundreds of times. Essentially, every time he went over to the household. Deciding what witnesses to call was really important, and we lumped them into various categories: coworkers, children from the neighborhood who are now adults, other adults in the neighborhood, family, and then these sort of, unrelated witnesses, the teachers and the counselors for the complainant. And also Ethan's first grade teacher. What we ended up doing was focusing on grouping them for trial so they wouldn't be called in all kind of a disjointed manner. So talking about the coworkers is really important because the complainant had alleged that he was molested hundreds of times. Every time he went over to the household, he said he went over after school, was molested hundreds and hundreds of times over the course of 2 years. What was interesting, though, was at trial, his mother said, oh, no, he'd only been over there a handful of times when her father was still alive and she couldn't care for him because she had to take her dad to a doctor's appointment or there was an issue. So she actually testified consistently with Mrs. Tomasic, who said the complainant had only been over a handful of times before his grandfather had passed away. But moving on to the coworkers, they were so important because Dennis worked these crazy hours. And so Kim and Lizzie, talk to us about the coworkers and the documents that you received, because that was really important.
The work records were really important because the complainant was alleging that every day after school, sometime around 3 or after 3, he would go over to the Tomasic's house, he'd get molested, and then go home. And this was happening constantly every day. So, during one of his stories, it was happening every day. So the work records were extremely important because they showed that Dennis worked these crazy hours. He would go in around 9 a.m. and then he would sometimes work until 11, midnight, 1 a.m. So it was extremely important that we use these records. And mind you, the first attorney had these work records, but did not use them. But if you look at his work records, he was constantly working. I mean, there were months where he had maybe like 2 or 3 days off. It wasn't just a Monday through Friday thing. He was constantly working. So he literally could not have been there to molest the complainant because he was at work.
Part of the problem was that this business had shut down. So authenticating these records was going to be an issue because we needed to find someone who had worked in human resources or had been his supervisor. The best witness we had unfortunately passed away, as Lizzie had indicated. So then Kim had to go on the hunt. Who am I thinking about, right? I just read
George Clooney.
I know. Kim had to go on the hunt for someone to authenticate these time records.
Yes, and that took quite a bit of time. It wasn't as easy as making a single phone call to someone who was in charge of all the records. I got a hold of someone after many tries. They weren't the person that was in charge of those records themselves, so she would suggest somebody else, and then it was kind of a domino effect, and it took some time, but we were able in the end to find someone who could authenticate those records for us.
And the records spanned years. And tell us what you did with the records, because we had these records. No juror wants to read hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pages of somebody's timesheet. So tell us what you did with the records.
We went ahead and made a calendar, and so we could make that visual for them, and we would just color in the days where Dennis was at work and left blank the days that he wasn't. So it was easy to see at a glance each month how much he was actually at the job and not at home.
And it's really important to get those records accurate. So I went through the records and put the calendars together. Then I gave it to Kim, said, can you please double check? And actually, I did have mistakes.
Oh, wait a minute. Hang on. We've already given out bonuses for the year.
Right?
We're going to need... Right, we're going to need to talk to you privately. Yeah, we're going to need to speak with you privately, Lizzie, after this.
Throwing myself under the bus. So, because it's really important because they're summaries, so they have to be completely accurate. Not just because, they should be accurate, but if they're not, we can't use them. So I went through them, Kim went through them and corrected the very few errors. The one error I had.
Minuscule.
Very, very small. And then we had another person who was working for us at the time look at them as well. And then I looked at them again. I think they were double checked at least 5 times to make sure that every single part of it was accurate.
And then because they were summaries of records, we obviously supplied the records to the prosecutor because we were using them as an exhibit, but also we supplied the summaries and notified them that we intended to use these summary calendars because the court rule allows that if the evidence is so voluminous. And so the rule of evidence allowed us to do it. We told them we were going to do it. There was no objection to that. I mean, they could object. They didn't.
But also, the records that we had, they weren't typed. These were from 1994, 1995, 1996. And so these were all handwritten by the HR person. Apparently, the workers would go in, say what time they got there, and then say what time they left, and they would write it down. So it was terrible handwriting. So it was really hard to see, which I think was probably why I had one mistake.
That's right.
But the handwriting was terrible. There were just pages and pages and pages. So it's just way easier for the jury just to look at a calendar and visualize how often he worked. There was, like I said, 1 month where everything was in blue. Almost everything was in blue. There was like 2 days where he didn't work.
If I may add, if it sounds like this was almost a reversal of the roles in terms of the amount of evidence that we bring in, it absolutely was. We drowned the government in documents, and even if they didn't believe the words, they being the jurors, if they didn't believe the words coming out of anyone's mouth, the documents, the exhibits, the things that we brought in.
Which was way different than the first trial.
Certainly, yes.
And I want to add, when I said, I think I've said a couple of times, like, oh, the government didn't object, it's because they didn't have grounds to object. I don't want it to make it seem like they were throwing in the towel. They fought us tooth and nail on this case every step of the way.
A lot of
to
the
try
discovery, we had to go back and ask multiple times.
Right. Well, before we get to that, which is so important, how did you talked about blue. Did you just pick blue out of the blue? That's a pretty good pun for this time of the morning.
So I did some research on how colors affect jurors, which is something you wouldn't think about, but it even said studies have shown that jurors react negatively if the defendant wears red because it seems to be a warning sign or a sign that they're lying. But blue is a trustworthy color. And actually, they tell people that help presidents or presidential candidates get ready for campaigning and speeches and stuff, tell them to wear blue because it's a trustworthy color, but not red, because that makes it seem like you're lying. So I just applied that to the calendars because that particular blue was calming and trustworthy, apparently.
I see you looking my way, Lizzie. Is that because I'm wearing a blue shirt and a blue bow tie?
It's because I trust you so much.
Am I presidential?
Yes.
Is that what you're saying?
You're just presidential and trustworthy.
Well, Takura mentioned the fight over discovery, and this was fascinating because when we took the case over, the prosecutor has the ethical and legal responsibility to turn over all discovery to us. We had gotten some of the file from the appellate lawyers, but we didn't want to just rely on that, as amazing as they are, because let's say they forgot to give us a police report or a document, then we would be, not doing our due diligence. So we wanted discovery from the prosecutor. We filed our discovery demand. Takura, did we get it?
So if I uttered the same guffaw that I initially wanted to, that this would deafen our listeners, the short answer is no.
We had to file a discovery motion, and then we had to file another one, and then another one. What ended up happening was the prosecutor would say, well, just tell us what you want. And we would say, we want everything you have. I don't know what you have, right? I may know about 10 police reports, but maybe you have 12, or maybe you have more witness interviews than I'm aware of. No, I'm not going to articulate what we want, because this isn't the issue is not, well, we're missing one item. The issue is we want everything. We had to go back multiple times in front of the court, and the court was taking the same tactic as the prosecutor. Tell us what you want. Tell me what you want. We had to keep saying the same thing. One time I was in Boston for work. Takura argued the motion, and then I called him afterward. How did it go? And he's like, they still keep saying the same thing. Like, tell us what you want. Ultimately, the court said, go over to the prosecutor's office, go through their file, and identify everything that you want, which was silly, in my opinion, but we did it. I went over, sat in a room, and then went through the file, identified all the things that we needed. Sure enough, we were missing items, and then had them copied for me, and then I walked out with them. But nothing was easy about this case. So again, when we say, oh, well, they didn't object, because they didn't have legal grounds to it, they fought us at trial. So we talked about the calendars for the coworkers, and then you interviewed, dozens and dozens of coworkers of Dennis. The one takeaway was this guy worked a ridiculous amount of hours. He was a tool and die engineer, very committed to his job. He said if he wasn't committed, people could get injured or killed, right? So he took it very seriously. And then we Takura selected a handful of witnesses, probably, what do you think, coworkers, T? 6, 7, 8?
8.
Okay, so 8 coworkers who testify that when Dennis would come into work, when Dennis would leave, frequently Dennis would still be there when they would leave. And it was really important to paint that picture for the jury that he was at work when these events supposedly happened. He just was not home.
And I'll add very quickly, for the witnesses, we decided on what I'll call a funnel approach. So for someone on the outside looking in, the relationships that Dennis and Kim, Ethan, and Shelby had to these people, they grew closer as the trial went along. So co-workers first who only knew Dennis as co-workers, and then others who knew him and hung out with him and went snowmobiling and hung out with each other's family. So with each witness, what we decided to do was, as each witness who testified, we made sure that they knew more about Dennis than the previous witness, right? So first co-workers who only worked with him, and then others who he spent time with outside of the job, doing activities with families, going up north to the cabin and so on. Because our concern was we didn't want to put people to sleep. So each witness brought something and added something new to the puzzle.
So Takura, one thing I want to talk about really quick is what happened, just so people know, things do go wrong in trial. Nothing goes smoothly. It never will. So you have to be prepared for when things go wrong. What happened at the trial where all of us almost, had a heart attack at once?
Oh, my days. Right. So we mentioned earlier the gentleman who was testifying from Alaska, but we also had a witness who was in Florida. He was on a humongous screen. There was a delay, so when I asked the question, I'd wait a second or two so that he'd hear it, then he'd respond. And to be clear, every time I sent an email or spoke with someone on the phone, we'd agreed very early on we will not talk about any time that Dennis spent in prison. So this gentleman is talking, oh my days. And he says, I asked him a question. He says, so you mean the first time when he went away to prison? I
think, was it the first thing he said? He said when he was convicted.
Right.
And then the second, then he kept going with, and when he was in prison, he just like kept adding on, and making it worse.
Because of the delay. So I don't know how I looked.
I know how you looked. You looked like you wanted to kill someone.
My knees, I held on to the podium because my knees buckled. They felt like it. My head was spinning. I was lightheaded. And I thank you. Thank you was all I could come up with. And ultimately, we got back on track. But every question that came out of my mouth thereafter, I was just thinking about what he revealed. But it turned out to be a blessing because it allowed Kim, when she testified, to talk about the experience and how it impacted her when Dennis was away. But in those moments, except for when we were waiting for the verdict, I can tell you that I thought, boy, all of this for nothing. It was all for naught. And I felt sick to my stomach. I couldn't believe it.
Well, we had really talked and thought strategically about how we wanted to handle that first trial. Our fear in this case was a jury hearing that he had been convicted before by a prior jury thinking, well, one jury already convicted him. Why are we here again? And, especially now, but this has really been the situation since I started practicing. When you have a claim of rape or sexual assault or sexual molestation, jurors do tend to believe the complainant, and you have to kind of pull them back to this neutral ground. And that's what's going on in our culture right now, where you'll hear people say, well, you have to believe someone. Being supportive as a family member or a friend or counselor is very different than the role of a juror. Their role is not to just believe someone. And we really thought strategically about how to handle this first trial. So we all had agreed with the court that it would be referenced if there was any impeaching of,
proceeding.
Right, a prior proceeding. So if you had to ask somebody about prior testimony, you'd say, you testified in a prior hearing about this, but you would not say a prior trial or prison. And then for that to happen, everybody just stopped on our side. The funny thing about it was, so, Lizzie and I are panicked. Takura is, about to just pass out, I think. And then I look over at Dennis, who I'm sitting next to. He's literally leaning back in his chair,
half smiling.
Right. Because he was like, I don't care if they know I went to prison because I went to prison. I was falsely convicted. I don't care if they know. And we had told him strategically why we made this decision. He was on board with it. So I look over and I'm like, are you okay? And he's like, yeah. He's like, that jury knew I've been to prison. You know what I'm saying? And the point is, he'd been to prison on this allegation, but never about anything else. He didn't even have a traffic ticket when he was accused of this. I mean, he'd never spoken to the police. I have traffic tickets. I know Takura in his fancy Camaro. He's got just speeding tickets. But Dennis had nothing. And he was like, I don't care if that jury knows. They should know. And so he was the coolest one on our side.
While the rest of us are like, should we pass out?
I know.
What do I do? Give me the signal. I'll pass out real quick.
I know.
And to be clear, remember, this was on the heels of the Larry Nassar news, the Indy Star article. It was around that time when all of this was coming out. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it wasn't something that we just imagined.
Also, what was funny was, so Takura numerous times told all the witnesses, don't mention the conviction, don't mention him going to prison, don't mention any of that. Well, before each person who had to testify via Skype, before it was time for them to call in, I would go out into the hallway and call them and let them know, okay, it's your turn, go ahead and call. And I would tell each one of them, remember, don't speak about prior conviction, don't speak about him going to prison. And I told that man those things, and he just ignored them.
Well, it was funny because we had, it's not automatic that someone can testify by video. I mean, you have to file a motion. You've got to get the court to agree to it. And because we had witnesses.
Electronics, even.
Right. Oh, it's very challenging to get them on. Not all courts are equipped for that easily.
Different time zones.
Yeah.
Right. Oh, it's quite, we had Alaska, Colorado, a couple of witnesses in Florida. But this gentleman afterwards, so these witnesses are prepared for, what sort of questions they'll be asked and how the courtroom goes and everything. So they were all prepared. But afterward, he sent me an email that night. How did I do? And I thought, well.
You didn't tell him the real answer.
No, we didn't. I thought, well, I'm going to wait for the verdict, and then I'll tell you how you did, because if it comes back the way it should, I'll say you did great. And he did do great. He did get the information we wanted out there. I mean, he wanted to be helpful. And
especially because I believe he was one of Dennis's supervisors previously.
He was.
Right. So he did do great when it all comes down to it. But it was a sort of a heart-stopping moment at that moment in time. All the coworkers, again, spoke about Dennis's when he was at work, which is so important when you put someone and you can place them at, obviously, another scene. And then we had the work records. The next category of witnesses we called were adult neighbors who could testify, one, about Dennis's hours. What did they call Dennis, and what was a problem with the neighbors because of the hours that he worked?
So Dennis would come home at about, like Lizzie said earlier, midnight, sometimes as late as 1 o'clock in the morning, and cut his grass. They called him nocturnal because he'd cut his grass in the middle of the night.
With flashlights strapped
right.
to the mower.
And all the neighbors knew it. So all the neighbors were able to say, this guy is never home during the week. He's always working. And it was hilarious that the neighbors were like, yeah, we'd hear him mowing his lawn at midnight, 1 o'clock in the morning because it had to get done. And that's what Dennis, we were like, well, why didn't you do it on the weekend? He's like, well, I needed to get it done. So he would do it at night.
What's funny, too, is that it's not a small yard. Like that,
No.
that yard is
No.
large.
No.
That took
Right.
a while to cut.
And they also testified that, again, they would be over at the Tomasic household. Kim Tomasic ran a very open household. People would come over, in, out. They never saw the complainant there. So they were really kind of twofold. Not ever seeing the complainant at the house and Dennis's long hours. And the woman who was next door, who ran the child care home, said, you can hear everything, right? I mean, I can hear them talking. I can hear them getting ready for dinner. If there was a child screaming in that bedroom, I would have heard it. And the kids would have heard it because they were outside all the time.
Yeah, I did spend a lot of time at that home and next door, that is, and in the Tomasic household. But yes, I spoke with a lot of the witnesses. And then we spoke next with people who at the time were children but were now adults.
And they talked about who they hung around with and what they did. The Tomasic kids were outdoor kids. Kim said, listen, I don't care the rain, sleet, or snow, right, the season. The kids were outside playing. That's what they should be doing predominantly, not sitting around playing video games. And Ethan was an amazing bike rider, the BMX bike riding. Shelby was an amazing athlete. They were outside all the time. And the complainant was more of an indoor kid. Right. He liked to play video games. Nothing wrong with that, but that's what he was doing at the time. And so all these kids talked about their friend circle and that they really didn't play with him because he wasn't outside playing. And these are adults who could remember back. And as Takura mentioned earlier, we had one witness who still was bitter over the toy being thrown on the roof.
That's right.
But they were really important to talk about what was going on.
And they were also able to confirm that Dennis was never home at that time, too. Many of them said they hardly ever saw him. And when they did see him at the home on those rare occasions, he was outside tinkering with things. He was never in the house.
Right. They said they knew Mrs. Tomasic because she was always home, but they didn't know Mr. Tomasic. Some of them said, well, I might have seen him once or twice.
And also the complainant's own parents, in talking about what they did as a family, made it clear that all the things that the Tomasic and their friends were into that they simply did not engage in as a family.
we had the other witnesses who we talked about, the counselors, Ethan's first grade teacher, and then we went to the family. That was the last grouping of witnesses we had. And we called Ethan, Shelby, Kim Tomasic, and then Dennis testified. He testified last. What was interesting is everyone described Kim Tomasic as being this very gregarious, outgoing woman who would not, she was loud and she's fun and she wouldn't tolerate anything. When she got on the stand, though, she was so overwhelmed with emotion that she was really quiet. She was very soft-spoken. And we really had to delve into that with her as to why everyone's describing her as being outgoing and she has just the emotion that is so quiet. And that was really important for the jury to know. And then I think the family was great, but really the star was Shelby.
Absolutely.
She was so charming. So they were both so genuine, Ethan and Shelby, about the love they had for their father. And Dennis testified at the end. We spoke to him at length about that. We really didn't feel he needed to testify, but he wanted to testify. He said, I didn't do this, right? I've been accused of this. I've been in prison for crimes I didn't commit. I want to get out there and tell the jury I didn't do it. And he did a great job. I mean, he was our last witness and just unequivocally said, I did not do this.
And, some clients have trouble with, even they could be telling the truth and telling their story, but they have trouble with the prosecutor crossing them. And I think Dennis still did absolutely great. He was perfect the whole way through.
He absolutely was great. And he, I think finally, after all those years, he was able to speak up in a courtroom, not just have lawyers talk for him, but actually say himself, I did not do it.
Mm-hmm. Right.
One group of witnesses or witness that we did not call is we called no experts. The government did. The government called an expert who I know,
quote unquote, expert.
Right, who's testified a lot about, his testimony was that anyone could be a child molester. Including himself, the judge, the jury, and
he actually said those words, mind you.
Right. That's not an exaggeration. Right. And that if a person is exhibiting negative signs, so for example, they are using drugs or they are stealing, that's a sign they've been sexually assaulted. If a person is exhibiting positive signs, they're an Olympic athlete, 4-point student, that's a sign they've been molested because they're trying to make their life perfect.
How about no change, Mary?
Oh, well, if there's no change, that's also an indicator someone's been molested. Right, funny you should ask, because that's a sign they're just trying to normalize their life. This gentleman testifies over and over and over again and continues to do so. We did not call an expert because we didn't want this to be a battle of the experts. We felt like the facts were so strong on our side that this case was winnable without an expert. We used an expert at a Daubert hearing to try and get the government's expert precluded from testifying because we just thought his testimony is so ridiculous that it should not even be allowed in a court of law.
It was offensive, I think.
Right. We filed what's called a Daubert motion, D-A-U-B-E-R-T, where the government has to put the witness on the stand, the expert. We're able to challenge that witness. We filed a really comprehensive brief. We brought in our own expert to talk about why their expert was wrong on so many things. And the judge said, I'm going to allow him to testify. And that was essentially it. But we didn't call an expert at trial. We didn't feel like we needed to. We just crossed their expert. And we had a lot to cross their expert on. We crossed their other witnesses. They had a medical doctor. They had all these other people on. But when it came time for closing, right, this was, for all the marbles, right? This is it. And we use a reasonable doubt board in a lot of cases, not all, but this really lended itself to that. And what it is, it's a big board that we have, and we have all the reasons for reasonable doubt on these big, huge, but think of them as enormous sticky notes. And
they actually are. They're the Post-it brand. They're huge Post-its.
Right. Who knew, right? They're Post-it notes for giants, right? And then we write on there all the reasonable doubt. So as the trial is going on, we're pulling information about all the reasonable doubt that has occurred. So when I'm giving the closing, I'm taking up these big sticky notes and putting them on this board. It's another visual for the jury to see all the reasonable doubt that exists in the case. During the closing, and we also had a big white board with all the names of the witnesses who the first trial lawyer never called. 22, I believe, right? 22 witnesses.
That's right.
We could have called 50 or even more
We
than
actually
that.
had to break it down,
Right.
just to 20.
Right. And it was Takura who told me, like, stop, right? Like, you can't keep putting these people on witness lists, right? This is too many witnesses. But I was so, like, I wanted to make sure we really got this point across. But we put them up there. During the closing, the complainant, and I didn't hear this, but you did, said at one point while I was talking, he hollered out, liar, liar. Because I'm so in the zone, right? I mean, anything could be going on around me. I have no idea. And one of the jurors, I did see this, turned to him and said, you be quiet. So I thought, well, that I didn't hear what he had said, but that seems like a good sign.
Right.
Then we had a few jurors crying during closing because at that point they knew that Dennis had been in prison for 9 years. They also had a chance to see every member of the Tomasic household and hear them testify, really get a sense of who they were as people and who this family was. They were such a good, close-knit, kind group of people. And this tragedy and travesty happened to them. And so then we finished closing, and closing lasted for quite a while. Then, for those of you who don't know, the government gets to go first, then we go next, and then the government gets to come back up. They get to argue again. I don't like that.
Yeah.
I don't like that at all, right? I want them to end on my note. And they did. That the government fought tooth and nail, as we said. They fought really hard. And then how long was the verdict? Or how long was the jury out?
It was out for a very, very short 19 minutes. And the reason I know that is because I almost missed the verdict, getting snacks and water for everyone.
We weren't even done packing up. When the trial is over, closings are done, the jury has read the instructions, and they go back to deliberate. I went over, as I frequently do, shook the hand of the prosecutor. We were talking a little bit, and then we weren't even packed up, and we heard the buzzer. Then we thought, well, they want the exhibits because we put in all the exhibits in this case. We called, as Takura said, more witnesses than the government. We put in all the exhibits. They didn't put any in. They tried to get some in. We objected. They couldn't come in. And then they said, no, they have a verdict. At that time, even though you think it's a good sign, you don't know. And you are second guessing yourself on, should I have kicked a juror off? I maybe had questions about a particular juror. You're just second guessing all the decisions that you've made. But for us, and more so for the Tomasics, it worked out extremely well. He was acquitted on all charges. The jury was adamant that they knew that he had not committed these offenses. We argued in closing, which is, a departure, but we argued that he was innocent. Frequently, you just really are talking about reasonable doubt and talking about the government, not meeting their burden and carrying their burden. We did that, but we went the extra step to say, he's innocent. Even if you don't believe that, you still can acquit him. But in this case, he really is innocent. And Dennis was on board with that. I actually had a lawyer who knew that, criticized us and said, well, it's burden shifting. You took a real risk there. And we knew it was a risk. It was a calculated risk. We had spoken with this about Dennis, and it was very important for Dennis to not just be acquitted, but to be exonerated. It's not just that the government didn't meet their burden, it's that he didn't do it.
Right.
And it was really important for that to be said in a courtroom, and he now is on the National Registry of Exonerations. It was, and I think, a very fitting argument to make in that case. I mean, I take criticisms, you always try and learn from them, but on this one, I disagree with it. It was a risk, and it's not a risk we take in every case. But in this one, we absolutely wanted to, and it panned out.
And when the verdict was read, the courtroom, it was just so amazing because it just instantly, everyone on Dennis's side, almost everyone started crying. I cried.
My mother did.
Takura's mother did while I held her hand. Tony, our firm administrator, cried. It was just so full of emotion and knowing that it was over. Dennis was finally going home and didn't have to worry, am I going to stay home? He was exonerated. He was finally going to move on.
Well, when the jury came out, So, it was just a few minutes from the time the buzzer rang to the time, the jury comes out, but it seems like it's hours. You can't even sit in your seat. I mean, you're just so you just want to spring up. So when the jury came out, a juror had looked kind of head nodded at me a little bit. And then I thought, well, what is, give me a little what I thought was a wink. What does that mean, right? What does that mean? Is that a good sign? I mean, why would he be winking at me if it wasn't a good sign? So we're sitting there, we're holding Dennis's hand. Then, we stand up to hear the verdict, and there are 2 counts here. And our big concern was that they may think, split the verdict, right? We'll acquit him on one, he's guilty on another, which would do absolutely nothing for him because he would go back to prison and spend the rest of his life there. I mean, he would die in a prison cell being an innocent man. And we had vowed to Dennis that no matter what the verdict, we would never stop fighting for him as long as it took, because we were 100% convinced he was innocent. And we would join forces with the Tebers again if we needed to, right? I mean, they're amazing appellate lawyers. If we got to join forces, we will. So then the jury comes out. So Takura's on the left of Dennis. I'm on the right. Dennis is in the middle.
I'm on Tony's lap.
That's right. Because Lizzie couldn't come up into the well because the jury had come back and security wouldn't let her. So she had to sit on Tony's lap. There was no more room on our side of the courtroom. Right. And then when the verdict is read, Takura, what does Dennis do?
He crumbled. He fell to his knees. He was on the ground. It was, I'll never forget that moment, ever.
And one time, we had an acquittal in another criminal sexual conduct case, and this young man, we firmly believed in his innocence. When the verdict was read, he leaned into Takura and was crying, and then was using Takura's shirt to kind of blow his nose. Right? Yeah. So Takura's I don't care, I'm just getting dry clean.
You're so nice.
Yeah. But then I went and hugged Kim Tomasic, Shelby, Ethan. They were in the gallery. Everyone was crying. And, the court asked if we wanted the jury to be polled. I didn't even hear it. Takura said, no, we're good.
Right.
We went back to speak to the jurors. They showed us the little styrofoam cup that they used.
I wish we would have taken that.
Oh, me too. Yeah. They went back. They all wrote. The first thing they did was just write what they think the verdict should be on the counts. All of them voted not guilty. So that's literally the first thing they did. Then they all used the bathroom. Then they came back out. And that was the jury deliberations. I mean, they sat for 2 weeks, listened so attentively to the case. I think we wrapped it up really well in closing. And it was just such a fitting end for Dennis. And he's on the National Registry of Exonerations. We are still fighting for him to get compensation.
Which is just insane.
Right. Mm-hmm. Under the Wrongful Imprisonment Compensation Act, the case is at the Michigan Supreme Court. I hope that we get some compensation for him. What he would get through the statute is not even what he was making per year at his job. So it wouldn't even compensate him financially for the loss, not to mention 9 years, not being there when his children graduated from high school, not being there when his son got married, not being there when his mother passed away, right? Not being there for any of it. I mean, it's no compensation when you look at what they lost for 9 years, this family, but at least it would be some recognition that he was wrongfully imprisoned and wrongfully convicted. And the Attorney General's office is fighting us on this, every step of the way. And I hope the Michigan Supreme Court sees and does, really recognizes and does the right thing.
Well, thank you, Mary, Takura, and Kim, for joining me today to talk about the Tomasics and the Tomasic case. I think, personally, we did a badass job on that case.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, an innocent man is home, so I have to agree with you, Lizzie.
Yes.
With his grandkids.
Yes.
Right?
So, thank you for joining us today and for sending in those questions. We really appreciate your feedback. So any type of questions you have or topics you want to hear about, go ahead and send us a message on Facebook, DM us through Instagram or Twitter, our website, cndefenders.com. We'd love to hear from you. So thank you so much, and we'll see you soon.
Thanks, Lizzie.
Thank you, Lizzie.
Thanks, Lizzie.